Chapter 4 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 4. Our Hero Enlarged Upon. Grumps. 2 years passed away. The Mustang Valley settlement advanced prosperously, despite 1 or 2 attacks made upon it by the savages, who were, however, firmly repelled. Dick Varley had now become a man, and his pup Crusoe had become a full-grown dog. The "silver rifle," as Dick's weapon had come to be named, was well known among the hunters and the redskins of the borderlands, and in Dick's hands its bullets were as deadly as its owner's eye was quick and true. Crusoe's education, too, had been completed. Faithfully and patiently had his young master trained his mind, until he fitted him to be a meet companion in the hunt. To "carry" and "fetch" were now but trifling portions of the dog's accomplishments. He could drive a fathom deep in the lake and bring up any article that might have been dropped or thrown in. His swimming powers were marvelous, and so powerful were his muscles that he seemed to spurn the water while passing through it, with his broad chest high out of a curling wave, at a speed that neither man nor beast could keep up with for a moment. His intellect now was sharp and quick as a needle. He never required a second bidding. When Dick went out hunting, he used frequently to drop a mitten or a powder horn unknown to the dog, and, after walking miles away from it, would stop short and look down into the mild, gentle face of his companion. "Crusoe," he said, in the same quiet tones with which he would have addressed a human friend, "I've dropped my mitten. Go fetch it, pup." Dick continued to call it "pup" from habit. One glance of intelligence passed from Crusoe's eye, and in a moment he was away at full gallop. Nor did he rest until the lost article was lying at his master's feet. Dick was loath to try how far back on his track Crusoe would run if desired. He had often gone back 5 and 6 miles at a stretch, but his powers did not stop there. He could carry articles back to the spot from which they had been taken, and leave them there. He could head the game that his master was pursuing, and turn it back, and he would guard any object he was desired to watch, with unflinching constancy. But it would occupy too much space and time to enumerate all Crusoe's qualities and powers. His biography will unfold them. In personal appearance he was majestic, having grown to an immense size even for a Newfoundland. Had his visage been at all wolfish in character, his aspect would have been terrible. But he possessed in an eminent degree that mild, humble expression of face peculiar to his race. When roused or excited, and especially when bounding through the forest with the chase in view, he was absolutely magnificent. At other times his gait was slow, and he seemed to prefer a quiet walk with Dick Varley to anything else under the sun. But when Dick was inclined to be boisterous, Crusoe's tail and ears rose at a moment's notice, and he was ready for anything. Moreover, he obeyed commands instantly and implicitly. In this respect he put to shame most of the boys of the settlement, who were by no means famed for their habits of prompt obedience. Crusoe's eye was constantly watching for the face of his master. When Dick said "go," he went. When he said "come," he came. If he had been in the midst of an excited bound at the throat of a stag, and Dick had called out, "Down, Crusoe," he would have sunk to the earth like a stone. No doubt it took many months of training to bring the dog to this state of perfection, but Dick accomplished it by patience, perseverance, and love. Besides all this, Crusoe could speak. He spoke by means of the dog's dumb alphabet in a way that defies description. He conversed, so to speak, with his extremities, his head and his tail. But his eyes, his soft brown eyes, were the chief medium of communication. If ever the language of the eyes was carried to perfection, it was exhibited in the person of Crusoe. But, indeed, it would be difficult to say which part of his expressive face expressed most. The cocked ears of expectation, the drooped ears of sorrow, the bright full eye of joy, the half closed eye of contentment, and the frowning eye of indignation, accompanied with a very slight pucker of the nose, and a gleam of dazzling ivory. Ha! No enemy ever saw this last piece of canine language without a full appreciation of what it meant. Then, as to the tail, the modulations of meaning in the varied wag of that expressive member, it's useless to attempt description. Mortal man cannot conceive of the delicate shades of sentiment expressible by a dog's tail, unless he has studied the subject. The wag, the waggle, the cock, the droop, the slope, the wriggle. Away with description. It is impotent and valueless here. As we have said, Crusoe was meek and mild. He had been bitten, on the sly, by half the ill-natured curs in the settlement, and had only shown his teeth in return. He had no enmities, though several enemies, and he had 1,000 friends, particularly among the ranks of the weak and the persecuted, whom he always protected and avenged whenever the opportunity offered. A single instance of this kind will serve to show his character. One day Dick and Crusoe were sitting on a rock beside the lake, the same identical rock near which, when a pup, the latter had received his first lesson. They were conversing as usual, for Dick had elicited such a fund of intelligence from the dog's mind, and had injected such a wealth of wisdom into it, that he felt convinced it understood every word he said. "This is capital weather, Crusoe, ain't it, pup?" Crusoe made a motion with his head which was quite as significant as a nod. "Oh, my pup, I wish that you and I might go and have a slap at the grizzly bars and look at the Rocky Mountains. Wouldn't it be nuts, pup?" Crusoe looked dubious. "What, you don't agree with me? Now tell me, pup, wouldn't you like to grip a bar?" Still Crusoe looked dubious, but made a gentle motion with his tail, as though he would have said, "I've seen neither Rocky Mountains nor grizzly bars, and know nothing about 'em, but I'm open to conviction." "You're a brave pup," rejoined Dick, stroking the dog's huge head affectionately. "I wouldn't give you for 10 times your weight in golden dollars, if there be sich things." Crusoe made no reply whatever to this. He regarded it as a truism unworthy of notice. He eventually felt that a comparison between love and dollars was preposterous. At this point in the conversation, a little dog with a lame leg hobbled to the edge of the rocks in front of the very spot where Dick was seated, and looked down into the water, which was deep there. Whether it did so for the purpose of admiring its very plain visage in the liquid mirror, or finding out what was going on among the fish, we cannot say, as it never told us. But at that moment a big, clumsy, savage-looking dog rushed out from the neighbouring thicket and began to worry it. "Punish him, Crusoe," said Dick quickly. Crusoe made one bound that a lion might have been proud of, and seizing the aggressor by the back, lifted him off his legs and held him, howling, in the air, at the same time casting a look towards his master for further instructions. "Pitch him in," said Dick, making a sign with his hand. Crusoe turned and quietly dropped the dog into the lake. Having regarded his struggles there for a few minutes with grave severity of countenance, he walked slowly back and sat down beside his master. The little dog made good its retreat as fast as 3 legs would carry it, and the surly dog, having swam ashore, retired sulkily, with his tail very much between his legs. Little wonder, then, that Crusoe was beloved by great and small among the well disposed of the canine tribes of the Mustang Valley. But Crusoe was not a mere machine. When not actively engaged in Dick Varley's service, he busied himself with private little matters of his own. He undertook modest little excursions into the woods, or along the margin of the lake. sometimes alone, but more frequently with a little friend whose whole heart and being seemed to be swallowed up in admiration of his big companion. Whether Crusoe botanized or geologized on these excursions we will not venture to say. Assuredly he seemed as though he did both, for he poked his nose into every bush and tuft of moss, and turned over the stones, and dug holes in the ground; and in short, if he did not understand these sciences, he behaved very much as if he did. Certainly he knew as much about them as many of the human species do. In these walks he never took the slightest notice of Grumps. That was the little dog's name. But Grumps made up for this by taking excessive notice of him. When Crusoe stopped, Grumps stopped and sat down to look at him. When Crusoe trotted on, Grumps trotted on too. When Crusoe examined a bush, Grumps sat down to watch him, and when he dug a hole, Grumps looked into it to see what was in there. Grumps never helped him. His sole delight was looking on. They didn't converse much, these two dogs. To be in each other's company seemed to be happiness enough. At least Grumps thought so. There was one point at which Grumps stopped short, however, and ceased to follow his friend, and that was when he rushed headlong into the lake and disported himself for an hour at a time in its cool waters. Crusoe was, both by nature and training, a splendid water dog. Grumps, on the contrary, held water in abhorrence, so he sat on the shores of the lake disconsolate when his friend was bathing, and waited till he came out. The only time when Grumps was thoroughly nonplussed was when Dick Varley's whistle sounded faintly in the far distance. Then Crusoe would prick up his ears and stretch out at full gallop, clearing the ditch and fence, and break with his strong elastic bound, and leaving Grumps to patter after him as fast as his 4-inch legs would carry him. Poor Grumps usually arrived at the village to find both dog and master gone, and would betake himself to his own dwelling, there to lie down and sleep, and dream, perchance, of rambles and gambols with his gigantic friend. Chapter 5. Of the Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 5. A mission of peace. Unexpected joys. Dick and Crusoe set off for the land of the Redskins, and meet with adventures by the way, as a matter of course. Night in the wild woods. One day the inhabitants of Mustang Valley were thrown into considerable excitement by the arrival of an officer of the United States Army and a small escort of cavalry. They went direct to the blockhouse, which, since Major Hope's departure, had become the residence of Joe Blunt, that worthy having, by general consent, been deemed the fittest man in the settlement to fill the major's place. Soon it began to be noised abroad that the strangers had been sent by government to endeavor to bring about, if possible, a more friendly state of feeling between the whites and the Indians, by means of presents, and promises, and fair speeches. The party remained all night in the blockhouse, and ere long it was reported that Joe Blunt had been requested, and had consented to be the leader and chief of a party of 3 men who should visit the neighboring tribes of Indians to the west and north of the valley as government agents. Joe's knowledge of 2 or 3 different Indian dialects, and his well-known sagacity, rendered him a most fitting messenger on such an errand. It was also whispered that Joe was to have the choosing of his comrades in this mission, and many were the opinions expressed and guesses made as to who would be chosen. That same evening Dick Varley was sitting in his mother's kitchen cleaning his rifle. His mother was preparing supper and talking quietly about the obstinacy of a particular hen that had taken to laying her eggs in places where they could not be found. Fan was coiled up in a corner sound asleep, and Crusoe was sitting at one side of the fire looking on at things in general. "I wonder," remarked Mrs. Varley, as she spread the table with a pure white napkin, I wonder what the sodgers are doing with Joe Blunt." As often happens when an individual is mentioned, the worthy referred to opened the door at that moment and stepped into the room. "Good evening, dame," said the stout hunter, doffing his cap and resting his rifle in a corner, while Dick rose and placed a chair for him. "The same to you, Master Blunt," answered the widow. "You've just comed in good time for a cut of venison." "Thanks, mistress. I suppose we beholden to the silver rifle for that." "To the hand that aimed it, rather," suggested the widow. "Nay, then, say rayther to the dog that turned it," said Dick Varley. "But for Crusoe, that buck would have been couched in the woods this night." "Oh, if it comes to that," retorted Joe, "I'd lay it to the door of Fan, for she'd niver been born, nuther would Crusoe. But it's good and tender meat, whatever ways you got it. Howsever, I've other things to talk about just now. Them sodgers that are eatin' buffalo tongues up at the blockhouse as if they'd niver eat meat before, and didn't hope to eat again for 12 months." "Ay, what of them?" interrupted Miss Varley. "I've been wondering what was their errand." "Of course you was, Dame Varley, and I've comed here a purpose to tell ye. They want me to go to the Redskins to make peace between them and us, and they've brought us a lot of goods to make them presents withal, beads and knives and looking glasses and vermilion paint, and sic like, just as much as'll be a light load for one horse. For you see, nothing can be done with the Redskins without gifts." "'Tis a blessed mission," said the widow. "I wish it may succeed. Do you think you'll go?" "Go? Ay, that I will." "I only wish they'd made the offer to me," said Dick with a sigh. "And so they do make the offer, lad. They've gi'n me leave to choose 2 men I'm to take with me, and I've come straight to ask you. Ay or no, for we must be up and away by break o' day to-morrow." Mrs Varley started. "So soon?" she said, with a look of anxiety. "Ay, the Pawnees are at the Yellow Creek just at this time, but I've heerd they're 'bout to break up camp and away west, so we'll need to use haste." "May I go, mother?" asked Dick, with a look of anxiety. There was evidently a conflict in the widow's breast, but it quickly ceased. "Yes, my boy," she said, in her own low, quiet voice, "and God go with ye. I know the time must come soon, and I thank him that your first visit to the Redskins will be on errand o' peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Dick grasped his mother's hand and pressed it to his cheek in silence. At that same moment Crusoe, seeing the deeper feelings of his master were touched, and deeming it his duty to sympathise, rose up and thrust his nose against him. "Ah, pup!" cried the young man hastily, "you must go too. Of course Crusoe goes, Joe Blunt." "Humph! I don't know that. There's no dependin' on a dog to keep his tongue quiet in times of danger." "Believe me," exclaimed Dick, flashing with enthusiasm, "Crusoe's more trustworthy than I am meself. If ye can trust the master, you's safe to trust the pup." "Well, lad, you may be right. We'll take him." "Thanks, Joe. And who else goes with us?" "I've been castin' that in my mind for some time, and I fixed to take Henry. He's not the safest man in the valley, but he's the truest, that's a fact. And now, younker, get your horse and rifle ready, and come to the blockhouse at daybreak to-morrow. Good luck to ye, mistress, till we meet again." Joe Blunt rose, and taking up his rifle, without which he scarcely ever moved a foot from his own door, left the cottage with rapid strides. "My son," said Mrs Varley, kissing Dick's cheek as he resumed his seat, "put this in the little pocket I made for you in your hunting shirt." She handed him a small pocket Bible. "Dear mother," he said, as he placed the book carefully within the breast of his coat, "the redskin that takes that from me must take my scalp first. But don't fear for me. You've often said the Lord would protect me, so he will, mother, for sure. It's an errand o' peace." "Ay, that's it," murmured the widow in a half soliloquy. Dick Varley spent that night in converse with his mother, and next morning at daybreak he was at the place of meeting mounted on his sturdy little horse, with the silver rifle on his shoulder and Crusoe by his side.
"That's right, lad, that's right. Nothing like keeping your time,"
said Joe, as he led out a pack horse from the gate of the block house, while his own charger was held ready, saddled by a man named Daniel Brand, who had been appointed to the charge of the block house in his absence. "Where's Henry? Oh, here he comes!" exclaimed Dick, as the hunter referred to came thundering up the slope at a charge, on a horse that resembled its rider in size, and not a little in clumsiness of appearance. "Ah, mes boys, him's a goot one to go," cried Henry, remarking Dick's smile as he pulled up. "No hoss on the plain can beat dis one, sir,
Now then, Henry, lend a hand to fix this pack. We've no time to palaver."
By this time they were joined by several of the soldiers and a few hunters who had come to see them start. "Remember, Joe," cried one, "if you don't come back in 3 months, we'll all come out in a band to seek you."
"If we don't come back in less than that time, what's left of us won't be worth seeking for,"
said Joe, tightening the girth of his saddle. "Put a bit in your own mouth, Henry," cried another, as the Canadian arranged his steed's bridle. "You'll need it more than your horse when you get among the red reptiles." "Rammit, if mine mott needs one bit, yours will need a padlock."
"Now, lads, mount,"
cried Joe Blunt, as he vaulted into the saddle. Dick Varley sprang lightly on his horse, and Henry made a rush at his steed and hurled his huge frame across its back with a violence that ought to have brought it to the ground; but the tall, raw boned, broad chested roan was accustomed to the eccentricities of his master, and stood the shock bravely. Being appointed to lead the pack horse, Henry seized its halter, and then the 3 cavaliers shook their reins, and waving their hands to their comrades, they sprang into the woods at full gallop, and laid their course for the far west. For some time they galloped side by side in silence, each occupied with his own thoughts, Crusoe keeping close behind his master's horse. The 2 elder hunters evidently ruminated on the object of their mission and the prospects of success, for their countenances were grave and their eyes cast on the ground. Dick Varley, too, thought upon the red man, but his musings were deeply tinged with the bright hues of a first adventure. The mountains, the plains, the Indians, the bears, the buffaloes, and 1,000 other objects danced wildly before his mind's eye, and his blood careened through his veins and flushed his forehead as he thought of what he should see and do, and felt the elastic vigor of youth respond in sympathy to the light spring of his active little steed. He was a lover of nature, too, and his flashing eyes glanced observantly from side to side as they swept along, sometimes through glades of forest trees, sometimes through belts of more open ground and shrubbery, anon by the margin of a stream, or along the shores of a little lake, and often over short stretches of flowering prairie land, while the firm, elastic turf sent up a muffled sound from the tramp of their mettlesome chargers. It was a scene of wild, luxuriant beauty, that might almost, one could fancy, have drawn involuntary homage to its bountiful Creator from the lips even of an infidel. After a time Joe Blunt reined up, and they proceeded at an easily ambling pace. Joe and his friend Henry were so used to these beautiful scenes that they had long ceased to be enthusiastically affected by them, though they never ceased to delight in them.
"I hope," said Joe, "that them sodgers will go their way soon. I've no notion of them chaps when they're left at a place with nothin' to do but whittle sticks."
"Why, Joe," exclaimed Dick Varley in a tone of surprise, "I thought you were admirin' the beautiful face of nature all this time, and you're only thinkin' 'bout the sodgers. Now that's strange."
"Not so strange after all, lad," answered Joe. "When a man's used to a thing, he gets to admire and enjoy it without speaking much about it. But it is true, boy, that mankind gets in course of time to think o' the little blessings he's used to."
"Oui," murmured Henry emphatically. "Well, Joe Blunt, it may be so, but I'm thankful I'm not used to this sort of thing yet," exclaimed Varley. "Let's have another gallop, so ho, come along, Crusoe," shouted the youth as he shook his reins and flew over a long stretch of prairie on which at that moment they entered. Joe smiled as he followed his enthusiastic companion, but after a short run he pulled up.
"Hold on, youngster," he cried. "Ye must larn to do as ye're bid, lad. It's trouble enough to be among wild Injuns and wild buffaloes, as I hope soon to be, without having wild comrades to look after."
Dick laughed and reined in his panting horse. "I'll be as obedient as Crusoe," he said, "and no one can beat him."
"Besides," continued Joe, "the horses won't travel far if we begin running all the wind out of 'em."
"Wall, I think we must give him to the pack hoss for to lead, eh?"
"Not a bad notion, Henry. We'll make that the penalty of running off again. So look out, Master Dick."
"I'm down," replied Dick with a modest air. "Obedient as a baby, and won't run off again till the next time. By the way, Joe, how many days' provisions did you bring?"
"2. That's enough to carry us to the Great Prairie, which is 3 weeks' distance from this. Our own good rifles must make up the difference, and keep us when we get there."
"And suppose we neither find deer nor buffalo," suggested Dick.
"I suppose we'll have to starve."
"Dat is comfortable to think upon," remarked Henry. "More comfortable to think of than to undergo," said Dick. "But I suppose there's little chance of that."
"Well, not much,"
replied Joe Blunt, patting his horse's neck.
"But, do you see, lad, you never can count for sartin on anything. The deer and the buffalo ought to be thick in them plains at this time, and when the buffalo are thick, they covers the plains till you can hardly see the end of 'em. But, you see, sometimes the rascally redskins takes it into their heads to burn the prairies, and sometimes you find the place that should have been black with buffalo, black as a coal with fire for miles and miles on end. At other times the redskins go huntin' in 'ticular places, and sweeps 'em clean of every hoof that don't get away. Sometimes, too, the animals seem to take a schooner at a place and keeps out of the way. But one way or another, men generally manage to scramble through."
"Look yonder, Joe!" exclaimed Dick, pointing to the summit of a distant ridge, where a small black object was seen moving against the sky. "That's a deer, ain't it?" Joe shaded his eyes with his hand and gazed earnestly at the object in question.
"You're right, boy, and by good luck we've got the wind of him. Cut and take your chance now. There's a long strip of wood as'll let you get close to him."
Before the sentence was well finished, Dick and Crusoe were off at full gallop. For 100 yards they coursed along the bottom of a hollow, then turning to the right, they entered the strip of wood, and in a few minutes gained the edge of it. Here Dick dismounted. "You can't help me here, Crusoe. Stay where you are, pup, and hold my horse." Crusoe seized the end of the line, which was fastened to the horse's nose, in his mouth, and lay down on a hillock of moss, submissively placing his chin on his forepaws, and watching his master as he stepped noiselessly through the wood. In a few minutes Dick emerged from among the trees, and, creeping from bush to bush, succeeded in getting to within 600 yards of the deer, which was a beautiful little antelope. Beyond the bush behind which he now crouched, all was bare open ground, without a shrub or hillock large enough to conceal the hunter. There was a slight undulation in the ground, however, which enabled him to advance about 50 yards further, by means of lying down quite flat, and working himself forward like a serpent. Further than this he could not move without being seen by the antelope, which browsed on the ridge before him in fancied security. The distance was too great even for a long shot, but Dick knew of a weak point in this little creature's nature which enabled him to accomplish his purpose. a weak point which it shares in common with animals of a higher order, namely curiosity. The little antelope of the North American prairies is intensely curious about everything that it does not quite understand, and will not rest satisfied until it has endeavored to clear up the mystery. Availing himself of this propensity, Dick did what both Indians and hunters are accustomed to do on these occasions. He put a piece of rag on the end of his ramrod, and, keeping his person concealed and perfectly still, waved this miniature flag in the air. The antelope noticed it at once, and, pricking up its ears, began to advance, timidly and slowly, step by step, to see what the remarkable phenomenon it could be. In a few seconds the flag was lowered, a sharp crack followed, and the antelope fell dead upon the plain.
"Hi, boy, that's good supper, anyhow,"
cried Joe, as he galloped up and dismounted. "Goot! Dat is better nor dried meat," cried Henry. "Give him to me. I will put him on my hoss, which is stronger than yon. But where is your hoss?" "He'll be here in a minute," replied Dick, putting his fingers to his mouth and giving forth a shrill whistle. The instant Crusoe heard the sound, he made a savage and apparently uncalled for dash at the horse's heels. This wild act, so contrary to the dog's gentle nature, was a mere piece of acting. He knew that the horse would not advance without getting a fright, so he gave him one in this way which sent him off at a gallop. Crusoe followed close at his heels, so as to bring the line alongside of the nag's body, and thereby prevent its getting entangled; but, despite its best efforts, the horse got on one side of a tree and he on the other, so he wisely let go his hold of the line, and waited till more open ground enabled him to catch it again. Then he hung heavily back, gradually checked the horse's speed, and finally trotted him up to his master's side.
"'Tis a clever cur, good sooth,"
exclaimed Joe Blunt in surprise. "Ah, Joe, you haven't seen much of Crusoe yet. He's as good a man as any day. I've done little else but train him for 2 years gone by, and he can do most anything but shoot. He can't handle the rifle nohow." "Ho! Then I think perhaps him could if he was try," said Henry, plunging on his horse with a laugh, and arranging the carcass of the antelope across the pommel of his saddle. Thus they hunted and galloped, and trotted and ambled on through wood and plain all day, until the sun began to descend below the tree tops of the bluffs on the west. Then Joe Blunt looked about him for a place on which to camp, and finally fixed on a spot under the shadow of a noble birch by the margin of a little stream. The carpet of grass on its banks was soft like green velvet, and the rippling waters of the brook were as clear as crystal, very different from the muddy Missouri into which it flowed. While Dick Varley felled and cut up firewood, Henry unpacked the horses and turned them loose to graze, and Joe kindled the fire and prepared venison steaks and hot tea for supper. In excursions of this kind it is customary to hobble the horses, that is, to tie their forelegs together so that they cannot run either fast or far, but are free enough to amble about with a clumsy sort of hop in search of food. This is deemed a sufficient check on their tendency to roam, although some of the knowing horses sometimes learn to hop so fast with their hobbles as to give their owners much trouble to recapture them. But when out in the prairies, where Indians are known or supposed to be in the neighborhood, the horses are picketed by means of a pin or stake attached to the end of their long lariats, as well as hobbled, for Indians deem it no disgrace to steal or tell lies, though they think it disgraceful to be found out in doing either. And so expert are these dark-skinned natives of the western prairies that they will creep into the midst of an enemy's camp, cut the lariats and hobbles of several horses, spring suddenly on their backs, and gallop away. They not only steal from white men, but tribes that are at enmity steal from each other, and the boldness with which they do this is most remarkable. When Indians are traveling in a country where enemies are prowling, they guard their camps at night with jealous care. The horses in particular are both hobbled and picketed, and sentries posted all around the camp. Yet, in spite of these precautions, hostile Indians manage to elude these sentries and creep into the camp. When a thief thus succeeds in effecting an entrance, his chief danger is past. He rises boldly to his feet, and, wrapping his blanket or buffalo robe around him, he walks up and down as if he were a member of the tribe. At the same time he dexterously cuts the lariats of such horses as he observes are not hobbled. He dare not stoop to cut the hobbles, as the action would be observed and suspicion would be instantly aroused. He then leaps on the best horse he can find, and uttering a terrific war whoop, darts away into the plains, driving the loosened horses before him. No such dark thieves were supposed to be near the camp under the birch tree, however, so Joe and Dick and Henry ate their supper in comfort, and let their horses browse at will on the rich pasturage. A bright ruddy fire was soon kindled, which created, as it were, a little ball of light in the midst of the surrounding darkness for the special use of our hardy hunters. Within this magic circle all was warm, comfortable, and cheery. Outside all was dark and cold and dreary by contrast. When the substantial part of supper was disposed of, tea and pipes were introduced, and conversation began to flow. Then the 3 saddles were placed in a row. Each hunter wrapped himself in his blanket, and, pillowing his head on his saddle, stretched his feet towards the fire and went to sleep, with his loaded rifle by his side and his hunting knife handy in his belt. Crusoe mounted guard by stretching himself out couchant at Dick Varley's side. The faithful dog slept lightly and never moved all night. But had anyone observed him closely, he would have seen that every fitful flame that burst from the sinking fire, every unusual puff of wind, and every motion of the horses that fed or rested hard by, had the effect of revealing a speck of glittering white in Crusoe's watchful eye. Chapter 5. Crusoe and his Master, Chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 6. The Great Prairies of the Far West. A remarkable colony discovered, and a miserable night endured. Of all the hours of the night or day, the hour that succeeds the dawn is the purest, most joyous, and the best. At least, so we think, and so think hundreds and thousands of the human family. And so thought Dick Varley, as he sprung suddenly into a sitting position next morning, and threw his arms with an exulting feeling of delight round the neck of Crusoe, who instantly sat up to greet him. This was an unusual piece of enthusiasm on the part of Dick, but the dog received it with marked satisfaction, rubbed his big hairy cheek against that of his young master, and arose from his sedentary position in order to afford free scope for the use of his tail.
"Ho, Joe Blunt! Henry, up, boys, up! The sun will have the start of us. I'll catch the nags."
So saying, Dick bounded away into the woods with Crusoe gambolling joyously at his heels. Dick soon caught his own horse, and Crusoe caught Joe's. Then the former mounted and quickly brought in the other 2. Returning to the camp, he found everything packed and ready to strap on the back of the pack horse.
"That's the way to do it, lad," cried Joe. "Here, Henry, look alive and get your beast ready. I do believe you're goin' to take another snooze."
Henry was, indeed, at that moment, indulging in a gigantic stress and a cadaverous yawn. But he finished both hastily, and rushed at his poor horse as if he intended to slay it on the spot. He only threw the saddle on its back, however, and then threw himself on the saddle.
"Now then, all ready?"
"Ay, oui, yes." And away they went at full stretch again on their journey. Thus day after day they travelled, and night after night they laid them down to sleep under the trees of the forest, until at length they reached the edge of the great prairie. It was a great memorable day in the life of Dick Varley, that on which he first beheld the prairie, the vast, boundless prairie. He had heard of it, talked of it, dreamed about it, but he had never, no, he had never realized it. 'Tis always thus. Our conceptions of things that we have not seen are almost invariably wrong. Dick's eyes glittered, and his heart swelled, and his cheeks flushed, and his breath came thick and quick. "There it is!" he gasped, as the great rolling plain broke suddenly on his enraptured gaze. "That's it! Oh!" Dick uttered a yell that would have done credit to the fiercest chief of the Pawnees, and, being unable to utter another word, he swung his cap in the air and sprang like an arrow from a bow over the mighty ocean of grass. The sun had just risen to send a flood of golden glory over the scene. The horses were fresh, so the elder hunters, gladdened by the beauty of all around them, and inspired by the irresistible enthusiasm of their young companion, gave the reins to the horses and flew after him. It was a glorious gallop, that first headlong dash over the boundless prairie of the far West. The prairies have often been compared, most justly, to the ocean. There is the same wide circle of space bounded on all sides by the horizon. There is the same swell, or undulation, or succession of long, low, unbroken waves that marks the ocean when it is calm. They are canopied by the same pure sky, and swept by the same untrammeled breezes. There are the islands, too, clumps of trees and willow bushes, which rise out of this grassy ocean to break and relieve its uniformity. And these vary in size and numbers, as do the isles of the ocean, being numerous in some places, while in others they are so scarce that the traveller does not meet one in a long day's journey. Thousands of beautiful flowers decked the green sward. The numbers of little birds hopped about among them.
"Now, lads," said Joe Blunt, reining up, "our troubles begin to-day."
"Our troubles? Our joys, you mean?" exclaimed Dick Varley.
"P'raps I don't mean nothin' of the sort," retorted Joe. "Man was never intended to swaller his joys without a strong mixture of troubles. I s'pose he couldn't stand 'em pure. You see, we've got to the prairie now."
"One blind hoss might see that," interrupted Henry.
"And we may or may not discover buffalo. And water's scarce, too, so we'll need to look out for it purty sharp, I guess. Else we'll lose our horses, in which case we may as well give out at once. Besides, there's rattlesnakes about in sandy places. We'll have to look out for them. And there's badger holes. We'll need to look sharp for them, lest the horses put their feet in 'em. And there's Injuns who'll look out pretty sharp for us if they get wind that we're in them parts."
"Yes, Miss Boys, and there's rain and thunder and lightning," added Henry, pointing to a dark cloud which was seen rising on the horizon ahead of them.
"It'll be rain," remarked Joe, "but there's no thunder in the air just now. We'll make up for yonder clump of bushes, and lay by till it's past." Turning a little to the right of the course they had been following, the hunters galloped along one of the hollows between the prairie waves before mentioned, in the direction of a clump of willows. Before reaching it, however, they passed over a bleak and barren plain where there was neither flower nor bird. Here they were suddenly arrested by a most extraordinary sight. At least it was so to Dick Varley, who had never seen the like before. This was a colony of what Joe called prairie dogs. On first beholding them, Crusoe uttered a sort of half growl, half bark of surprise, cocked his tail and ears, and instantly prepared to charge. But he glanced up at his master first for permission. Observing that his finger and his look commanded silence, he dropped his tail at once and stepped to the rear. He did not, however, cease to regard the prairie dogs with intense curiosity. These remarkable little creatures have been egregiously misnamed by the hunters of the West, for they bear not the slightest resemblance to dogs, either in formation or habits. They are, in fact, the marmot, and in size are a little larger than squirrels, which animals they resemble in some degree. They burrow under the light soil, and throw it up in mounds, like moles. Thousands of them were running about among their dwellings when Dick first beheld them. But the moment they caught sight of the horsemen riding over the ridge, they set up a tremendous hubbub of consternation. Each little beast instantly mounted guard on top of its house, and prepared, as it were, to
receive cavalry. The most ludicrous thing about them was, that although the most timid and cowardly creatures in the world, they seemed the most impertinent things that ever lived. Knowing that their holes afforded them a perfectly safe retreat, they sat close beside them, and as the hunters slowly approached, they elevated their heads, wagged their little tails, showed their teeth, and chattered at them like monkeys. The nearer they came, the more angry and furious did the prairie dogs become, until Dick Varley almost fell off his horse with suppressed laughter. They let the hunters come close up, waxing louder and louder in their wrath. But the instant a hand was raised to throw a stone or point a gun, 1,000 little heads dived into 1,000 holes, and 1,000 little tails wriggled for an instant in the air. Then a dead silence reigned over the deserted scene. "Bien, them's have dive into de boils of de heart," said Henry with a broad grin. Presently 1,000 noses appeared and nervously disappeared like the wink of an eye. Then they appeared again, and 1,000 pairs of eyes followed. Instantly, like Jack in the Box, they were all on the top of their hillocks again, chattering and wagging their little tails as vigorously as ever. You could not say that you saw them jump out of their holes. Suddenly, as if by magic, they were out. Then Dick tossed up his arms, and suddenly, as if by magic, they were gone. Their number was incredible, and their cities were full of riotous activity. What their occupations were the hunters could not ascertain, but it was perfectly evident that they visited a great deal and gossiped tremendously, for they ran about from house to house and sat chatting in groups. But it was also observed that they never went far from their own houses. Each seemed to have a circle of acquaintance in the immediate neighborhood of his own residence, to which, in case of sudden danger, he always fled. But another thing about these prairie dogs, perhaps considering their size, we should call them prairie doggies. Another thing about them, we say, was that each doggie lived with an owl, or, more correctly, an owl lived with each doggie. This is such an extraordinary fact that we could scarce hope that men would believe us, were our statement not supported by dozens of trustworthy travelers who have visited and written about these regions. The whole plain was covered with these owls. Each hole seemed to be the residence of an owl and a doggie, and these incongruous couples lived together apparently in perfect harmony. We have not been able to ascertain from travelers why the owls have gone to live with these doggies, so we beg humbly to offer our own private opinion to the reader. We assume, then, that owls find it absolutely needful to have holes. Probably prairie owls cannot dig holes for themselves. Having discovered, however, a race of little creatures that could, they very likely determined to take forcible possession of the holes made by them. Finding no doubt that, when they did so, the doggies were too timid to object, and discovering, moreover, that they were sweet, innocent little creatures, the owls resolved to take them into partnership, and so the thing was settled. That's how it came about, no doubt of it. There is a report that rattlesnakes live in these holes also, but we cannot certify our reader of the truth of this. Still, it is well to be acquainted with a report that is current among men of the backwoods. If it be true, we are of opinion that the doggie's family is the most miscellaneous and remarkable on the face of, or, as Henry said, in the bowels of the earth. Dick and his friends were so deeply absorbed in watching these curious little creatures that they did not observe the rapid spread of the black clouds over the sky. A few heavy drops of rain now warned them to seek shelter, so wheeling around they dashed off at speed for the clump of willows, which they gained just as the rain began to descend in torrents.
"Now, lads, do it slick. Off packs and saddles,"
cried Joe Blunt, jumping from his horse.
"I'll make a hut for you right off."
"A hut? Joe, what sort of hut can you make here?" inquired Dick.
"You'll see, boy, in a minute. Ah, lend me a hand here, Dick. De buckle am tight as de horse's own skin. Ah, de all right."
"Hello! What's this?" exclaimed Dick, as Crusoe advanced with something in his mouth. "I declare, it's a bird of some sort."
"A prairie hen," remarked Joe, as Crusoe laid the bird at Dick's feet. "Capital for supper."
Ah, that chin is superb. Good dog. Come here, I will clap you." But Crusoe refused to be caressed. Meanwhile, Joe and Dick formed a sort of beehive looking hut by bending down the stems of a tall bush and thrusting their points into the ground. Over this they threw the largest buffalo robe and placed another one on the ground below it, on which they laid their packs of goods. These they further secured against wet by placing several robes over them and a skin of parchment. Then they sat down on this pile to rest and consider what should be done next. "'Tis a bad lookout," said Joe, shaking his head. "I fear it is," replied Dick in a melancholy tone. Henry said nothing, but he sighed deeply on looking up at the sky, which was now of a uniform watery gray, while black clouds drove athwart it. The rain was pouring in torrents, and the wind began to sweep it in broad sheets over the plains, and under their slight covering, so that in a short time they were wet to the skin. The horses stood meekly beside them, their tails and heads equally pendulous, and Crusoe sat before his master, looking at him with an expression that seemed to say, "Couldn't you put a stop to this if you were to try?" "This'll never do. I try to git up a fire," said Dick, jumping up in desperation. "You may save yourself the trouble," remarked Joe dryly, at least as dryly as was possible in the circumstances. However, Dick did try, but he failed signally. Everything was soaked and saturated. There were no large trees. Most of the bushes were green, and the dead ones were soaked. The coverings were slobbery, the skins they sat on were slobbery, the earth itself was slobbery. So Dick threw his blanket, which was also slobbery, round his shoulders, and sat beside his companions to grin and bear it. As for Joe and Henry, they were old hands and accustomed to such circumstances. From the first they had resigned themselves to their fate, and wrapping their wet blankets round them, sat down, side by side, wisely to endure the evils that they could not cure. There is an old rhyme, by whom composed it we know not, and it matters little, which runs thus: "For every evil under the sun there is a remedy, or there's none. If there is, try and find it. If there isn't, never mind it." There is deep wisdom here in small compass. The principle involved deserves to be heartily recommended. Dick never heard of the lines, but he knew the principle well, so he began to "never mind it" by sitting down beside his companions and whistling vociferously. As the wind rendered this a difficult feat, he took to singing instead. After that he said, "Let's eat a bite, Joe, and then go to bed." "Be all means," said Joe, who produced a mass of dried deer's meat from a wallet. "It's cold grub," said Dick, "and tough." But the hunters' teeth were sharp and strong, so they ate a hearty supper and washed it down with a drink of rain water collected from a pool on top of their hut. They now tried to sleep, for the night was advancing, and it was so dark they could scarce see their hands when they held up before their faces. They sat back to back, and thus, in the form of a tripod, began to snooze. Joe's and Henry's seasoned frames would have remained stiff as posts till morning, but Dick's body was young and pliant, so he hadn't been asleep a few seconds when he fell forward into the mud and effectually awakened the others. Joe gave a grunt, and Henry exclaimed, "Ha!" but Dick was too sleepy and miserable to say anything. Crusoe, however, rose up to show his sympathy, and laid his wet head on his master's knee as he resumed his place. This catastrophe happened 3 times in the space of an hour, and by the 3rd time they were all wakened up so thoroughly that they gave up the attempt to sleep, and amused each other by recounting their hunting experiences and telling stories. So engrossed did they become that the day broke sooner than they had expected, and just in proportion as the gray light of dawn rose higher into the eastern sky did the spirits of these weary men rise with their soaking bodies. Chapter 7